History is full of revenge stories, but not the cool, noble kind people pretend to admire. I mean the dumb kind. The kind where emperors fight the ocean, geniuses erase rivals out of pure spite, kings punish entire cities because their feelings got hurt, and one insult somehow turns into war, torture, or a brand new car company. These are 10 of the dumbest revenge stories from history, and somehow every single one actually gets worse the more you hear. Number 1. The Concierge Coup, Aga Khan III and the Ritz. High society in the early 20th century was a battlefield of etiquette, where a misplaced glance or a slow-seated service could spark a social war. One of the most legendary, if perhaps slightly polished, anecdotes of this era involves Aga Khan III, the 48th Imam of the Nizari Ismaili Muslims. The story says that the Khan, a man of staggering wealth and international influence, once walked into the Ritz in London or Paris, the location shifts depending on who is telling it, dressed in somewhat casual or travel-worn attire. The maitre d', blinded by the rigid class structures of the time and failing to recognize the man beneath the clothes, gave him the cold shoulder. He was snubbed, perhaps even asked to leave, or told that no tables were available for someone of his stature. Most people would have written a stern letter or complained to the manager. Not the Khan. He allegedly responded the very next day by purchasing the entire hotel. Why? Not for the investment and not for the real estate. He bought it just to walk back in and personally fire the man who had disrespected him. While historians debate if every detail of the transaction was as swift as the legend suggests, the core of the story is rock solid. Aga Khan III was famously associated with the Ritz and moved through elite Europe like old money, wearing a silk glove over a steel fist. The anecdote survived because it captures the essence of ultra-rich vengeance. It isn't about a tantrum, it's about purchasing the entire building like a man buying a newspaper just to cancel one column. This is revenge at the concierge level, a reminder that when you have enough money, the entire world is your service industry, and the manager is just someone on your payroll. Number 2. Caligula versus the Atlantic Ocean. If they were an Olympic event for taking an inconvenience personally, the Roman Emperor Caligula would have retired the gold medal. In 40 AD, Caligula marched his legions to the northern shores of Gaul, modern-day France. The official plan was an invasion of Britain, a feat even Julius Caesar hadn't fully mastered. However, as the troops stood at the edge of the English Channel, the plan fell apart. Whether it was a mutiny by soldiers terrified of the ocean at the end of the world, or simply a logistical nightmare involving rough seas, the invasion was aborted before it began. Most rulers would call this a setback, go home and plan for next year. Caligula, however, apparently looked at the ocean and decided the Atlantic had committed a crime of treason against the emperor. In the version of the story that made him immortal for all the wrong reasons, he ordered his soldiers to draw their swords and charge into the waves, stabbing the water. He then commanded them to collect seashells, which he referred to as spoils of the sea and tribute from the conquered Neptune. He reportedly marched these shells back to Rome in a victory triumph, treating the whole thing like a military conquest over a god. Even if ancient writers like Suetonius loved exaggerating his madness to please later emperors, the story stuck because it captures Caligula's entire brand. He was a man so fragile that weather became an act of war. Imagine losing an argument with a body of water and then declaring yourself the winner. It was the ultimate "you can't fire me, I quit" move, played out on a continental stage with 10,000 witnesses. Number 3. The Erasure of Robert Hooke. Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke had the kind of feud that makes modern academic drama look like a polite exchange of holiday cards. Hooke was a brilliant polymath, the England's Leonardo, but he was also prickly and protective of his ideas. When Newton published his groundbreaking work on light and gravity, Hooke claimed that Newton had stolen the core concepts from him. Newton, a man who possessed a spectacular inability to let things go, nurtured this grudge for decades. The real revenge, however, happened after Hooke died. Newton rose to become the president of the Royal Society, essentially the supreme commander of science in England. Shortly after Hooke's passing, his laboratory was dismantled, his instruments were lost, and most tellingly, the only contemporary portrait of Robert Hooke vanished from the walls of the Society. To this day, we have no confirmed image of what Hooke actually looked like. Modern portraits are just forensic guesses based on written descriptions. Historians don't have a signed confession proving Newton personally threw the painting into the fireplace, but the suspicion exists for a reason. Newton had the motive, the power, and the historical track record of being a relentless crime hunter. In a fight between two of the greatest minds in history, Newton didn't just win the argument, he may have erased the man's face from time itself.
Number 4. Julius Caesar's premium ransom. In 75 BC, a young Julius Caesar was traveling across the Aegean Sea when he was kidnapped by Cilician pirates. These pirates were the terror of the Mediterranean, and they knew they had a wealthy Roman aristocrat on their hands. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar's reaction was not fear, it was deep, personal offense. He reportedly laughed in their faces, told them they clearly had no idea who he was, and insisted that he was worth at least 50 talents. This wasn't confidence, it was elite Roman ego operating without brakes. While his associates were sent away to gather the 50 talents, Caesar spent 38 days as a captive. He didn't act like a hostage, he acted like an annoyed guest. He wrote poetry and speeches and forced the pirates to listen to them. If they didn't praise his work, he called them illiterate barbarians. When he wanted to sleep, he ordered the pirates to be quiet. Most famously, he told them repeatedly, as a joke, that once he was free, he would return and have every one of them crucified. The pirates laughed, thinking this rich, eccentric kid was doing a bit of comedy. He wasn't doing comedy, he was doing scheduling. As soon as the ransom was paid and he was released at Miletus, Caesar immediately raised a small fleet, returned to the pirates' lair, and captured almost all of them. He took his 50 talents back, took all their treasure as well, and then crucified them exactly as he had promised. The pirates' last thought was likely the realization that the funny Roman kid was actually a terrifyingly literal person. Number 5. The 12-cylinder grudge. Lamborghini versus Ferrari. Ferruccio Lamborghini was a self-made millionaire who built tractors from surplus military hardware after World War II. He was successful, he was rich, and because he was an Italian man of means, he bought Ferraris. However, Lamborghini was a frustrated customer. He found that his Ferraris had constant clutch problems, the same kind of clutches he used in his tractors, but which seemed to fail under the stress of high-performance driving. According to the legendary version of the story, Ferruccio went to see Enzo Ferrari personally to offer a suggestion on how to improve the cars. Enzo, who was famously arrogant and viewed himself as a god of racing, reportedly brushed him off with a line that roughly translated to, "The problem isn't the car, it's the driver. Go back to your tractors and leave the cars to me."
Historians argue over the exact wording, but the sting of the insult was very real. Ferruccio didn't write an angry letter or post a bad review. He decided that the only way to get a decent car was to build one that would make Ferrari look obsolete. In 1963, he founded Automobili Lamborghini. He hired Ferrari's former engineers and tasked them with building a V12 Grand Tourer that was more refined and faster than anything coming from Maranello. This is what makes the story so beautiful. He built an entire global luxury brand out of pure spite. Every time you see a Lamborghini today, you are looking at industrialized pettiness, a 200-mile-per-hour monument to a man who was told he didn't know how to drive. Number 6. The Pastry War of 1838. The Pastry War sounds like something out of a children's book, but it was a very real, very bloody international conflict started by a baker's grievance. In the 1830s, Mexico was a place of constant civil unrest. During one riot in Mexico City, a French pastry cook named Monsieur Remontel claimed that Mexican officers had looted his shop and eaten all his cakes. He demanded 60,000 pesos in compensation, an astronomical sum for some tartlets and eclairs. The Mexican government naturally ignored him. Remontel, however, took his complaint to the French king, Louis Philippe. At the time, France was looking for any excuse to flex its imperial muscles in the Americas and collect unpaid debts from Mexico. They took the baker's story and made it the centerpiece of a diplomatic ultimatum. When Mexico refused to pay for the stolen pastries, France sent a fleet to blockade Veracruz and eventually began shelling the fortress of San Juan de Ulua. The war resulted in hundreds of casualties and the loss of Santa Anna's leg, which he later buried with full military honors, another story for another day. While the war was technically about broader debts and trade rights, it became branded in history books by the most unserious name imaginable because one pastry chef's hurt feelings were the spark. Imagine being on the front lines, explaining to your family that you're being shelled because a baker in the capital didn't get paid for his croissants. It is history trolling everyone involved.
Number 7. Princess Olga's Avian Artillery. 945 A.D. The Drevlians, a Slavic tribe, murdered Igor of Kiev, the husband of Princess Olga. They then had the audacity to send a diplomatic mission to Olga, suggesting that she should marry their prince, Mal, so they could take control of her lands. Olga, a woman who took betrayal and audacity very personally, decided that grief was fine, but revenge needed a creative structure. She told the Drevlian envoys she was honored and asked them to stay in their boat, saying her people would carry them into the city as a sign of respect. Once the boat was lifted and brought into the city, she had her men drop the boat and the envoys into a massive pit she had dug. She then watched as they were buried alive. But she wasn't done. She sent word to Prince Mal that she accepted, but needed his most distinguished men to escort her. When they arrived, she invited them to relax in a bathhouse, locked the doors, and burned them all alive. The finale, however, is the most famous part of the legend. During the siege of the Drevlian capital of Iskorostan, Olga told the starving inhabitants she would leave if they gave her a small tribute, 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every house. The locals, thinking she was being mercifully weird, complied. That night, Olga's men tied sulfur and cloth to the birds' feet
lit them and released them. The birds flew back to their nests in the thatched roofs of the city, turning the entire capital into a firebomb. It remains a masterclass in revenge, written by someone who viewed creativity as a weapon of war. Number 8. The Cadaver Synod, the trial of a corpse. In the year 897, the papacy reached a level of madness that no modern satire could touch. Pope Stephen VI hated his predecessor, Pope Formosus, with a burning administrative passion. Formosus had been dead for 9 months, but Stephen didn't think death was a good enough reason to let a grudge go. He had Formosus's rotting body exhumed, dressed in full papal robes and propped up on a throne in the basilica to stand trial. This event, known as the Cadaver Synod, was a formal legal proceeding. A terrified deacon was appointed to stand behind the corpse and speak for it, answering the charges of illegal accession to the papacy. Stephen VI reportedly spent the trial screaming at the silent, decaying body. Unsurprisingly, the corpse lost the case. Formosus was declared guilty, his acts as pope were annulled, and the 3 fingers he used for blessings were hacked off. His body was then dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber River. This was not a crime of passion, it was administrative hatred. It took all the usual ingredients of a power struggle and added decomposition. It remains the ultimate example of institutional pettiness. If you've ever thought a modern HR meeting was miserable, remember that medieval Rome once held a formal hearing against a man who had been dead for nearly a year. It proved that in the world of high-stakes politics, even the grave isn't a safe place to hide from an enemy with a law degree and a shovel.
Number 9. Michelangelo's Eternal Hell. Michelangelo Buonarroti was not a man you wanted to criticize. While he was working on the massive Last Judgment fresco on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, he was under constant scrutiny. One day, the Pope's master of ceremonies, a man named Biagio da Cesena, came to inspect the work. Biagio was a traditionalist and was horrified by the amount of nudity in the painting. He told the Pope that the work was disgraceful and more suited for a tawny tavern than the holiest chapel in Christendom. Michelangelo heard this review and decided that a verbal rebuttal wasn't enough. He painted Biagio into the scene, specifically in the bottom right corner, in hell. He depicted Biagio as Minos, the judge of the underworld, complete with donkey ears, symbolizing his foolishness, and a massive serpent wrapped around him, biting him specifically on his private parts. When Biagio complained to the Pope and begged to have his face removed from the wall, the Pope reportedly laughed and told him, "I have authority over heaven, but my power does not extend to hell. You'll have to stay there." For nearly 500 years, millions of people have walked into the Vatican and seen Biagio da Cesena being eternally punished. It is the most devastating bad review response in history, transforming a critic into a permanent painful joke on the most famous wall in the world. Number 10. Xerxes and the Whipping of the Sea. In 480 BC, the Persian king Xerxes I was building a massive military operation to conquer Greece. To move his army of hundreds of thousands across the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, he commissioned a series of sophisticated pontoon bridges.
However, just as the bridges were completed, a massive storm tore them apart, sinking the ships and scattering the supplies. Xerxes didn't blame the engineers for poor design, and he didn't blame the weather for being unpredictable. He decided the water itself had been disobedient to his king. According to the historian Herodotus, Xerxes ordered his executioners to give the Hellespont 300 lashes with a whip. He also had a pair of iron fetters, shackles, thrown into the water to imprison it, and he reportedly had red-hot irons used to brand the sea as if it were a runaway slave. While his men were whipping the waves, they were commanded to shout, "You salt and bitter water, your master lays this punishment upon you because you have wronged him." It is history's purest example of cosmic road rage. The sea had embarrassed a god-king in front of his entire army, and his answer was to try and arrest the ocean. It didn't work, obviously, but it remains a terrifying peek into the logic of absolute power. When no one can tell you you're being ridiculous, eventually you start trying to arrest the ocean. History proves that if you wait long enough, even the most powerful people will do something so spectacularly petty that it outlives their actual achievements. These stories weren't about justice. They were about ego, bad moods, and having enough power to make a mistake everyone would talk about forever. Stay tuned for more historical chaos.